The night was calm at Nova Venus Hospital, a human colony on a distant planet, rapidly expanding after the discovery of rare resources deep beneath its surface. Despite the state-of-the-art technology, the hospital still carried an old-world charm clean, efficient but with subtle echoes of a simpler time. Nurse Harper was preparing for her night shift, adjusting her uniformer, simple hospital dress that, by design, suited the planet's warm temperatures. Though not the most formal attire, she appreciated its practicality. It was a life of routine, no surprises, no chaos. But tonight, everything was about to change. As Harper meticulously organized patient files, the emergency room door crashed open with an unmistakable force. A group of doctors and technicians hurried through, pushing a gurney. But what lay upon it was no ordinary patient. It wasn't human. For a moment, Harper stood frozen, eyes locked on the being before her. Its gray, scaly skin shimmered under the fluorescent lights, and its eyes glowed with a fiery red intensity. Its body was humanoid in shape, but with elongated limbs and a muscular frame that radiated power. Its face, though unmistakably alien, held an expression Harper immediately recognized: pain, fear. "Stay calm, Harper. It won't attack." Dr. Lyle, a veteran in space medicine, tried to reassure her, his voice firm yet tinged with uncertainty. But Harper couldn't tear her gaze away. She'd heard stories of the Zetlaran alien species, infamous for their brutal conquests and merciless nature. The Zetla were known for their unthinkable strength and a history of exterminating entire civilizations. And yet, here was one of them, lying helpless in a human hospital. It didn't make sense. But there was something more, something even more perplexing. It appeared to be injured. "It's okay," Harper murmured to herself, more for reassurance than anyone else. Stepping forward cautiously, she approached the patient. She could feel the creature's unblinking gaze, sharp and intense. It watched her like a predator, yet there was something in its eyes, something that conveyed an unexpected vulnerability. The fear radiating from it was undeniable. "He's suffering from internal bleeding," Dr. Lyle explained quickly. "We need to operate now." "Harper, do you have experience with this type of trauma?" Harper swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. The situation was unlike anything she had ever encountered. Hesitation wasn't an option. If this being survived, it could change the trajectory of humanity. If she failed, she couldn't let herself think of the consequences. "Yes, Doctor. We'll do whatever it takes." With steady hands, Harper moved closer to the Zetla, gently placing her hands on its chest. She could feel its irregular, labored breathing beneath her touch. For a brief moment, their eyes locked against something shifted within her. Despite the distance between their worlds, Harper felt a strange connection. As if, in this moment, this alien, this enemy, was asking for her help. Harper adjusted her uniform, maintaining her professional distance, but her thoughts raced. The Zetla were infamous. There were no rumors of weakness, no talk of mercy. They were merciless conquerors, and anyone who crossed them rarely made it back. But here, in front of her, lay one of them, vulnerable and in need. The heart monitor began to beep more urgently, snapping Harper back into focus. There was no time to waste. "Prepare for surgery," Harper commanded, her voice steady but edged with determination. As the room shifted from a sterile hospital environment to a battlefield of life and death, she realized something. Saving this alien, this brutal warrior, could alter humanity's history in ways no one could predict. The room was bathed in cold, precise lighting, mirroring the heavy tension that hung in the air. The rhythmic beeping of the monitoring machines filled the space, creating a surreal atmosphere that made it feel as though time itself had slowed. Harper was ready, but beneath her composed exterior, nerves coiled tightly. She didn't know what to expect from the surgery. Everything about this was unprecedented. One thing, however, was clear. If the Zeitler survived, everything could change. The patient, now stabilized, lay motionless on the operating table. The other doctors and technicians were prepared, but Harper knew this was her moment. She would be the one to guide this operation. Dr. Lyle, standing beside her, cast a quick glance at the monitor. He exhaled deeply and gave her a subtle nod, the unspoken understanding between them clear. They were navigating uncharted waters alone, without a map and facing something far beyond their comprehension. As the scalpel met the Zeitler's thick, scaly skin, Harper's mind flickered with the absurdity of the situation. Humanity had always prided itself on being the dominant species, intelligent, resourceful, and technologically superior. And yet, here she was, in the presence of an alien life form. Her thoughts briefly spiraled. Who was truly the enemy? Was humanity really the superior force in the universe? Or was that just a myth, a story spun by those in power? With delicate precision, Harper removed the damaged tissue, revealing the Zeitler's internal organs. But as she worked, a peculiar sensation crept into her thoughts. Something wasn't right. It wasn't just the alien physiology or the strange foreign body lying before her. It was the uncomfortable realization that the notion of humanity as the dominant force in the galaxy seemed misguided. In this moment, with this creature, the boundaries between oppressor and oppressed seemed to blur. The alien's wounds weren't just physical, they were symptoms of a larger, more complicated story. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly. Hours passed in a blur of focused movements, but the Zeitler remained unresponsive. Harper began to wonder, was it possible that the creature would never wake up? Was this all a trap? An elaborate ruse set by a species more cunning than they could imagine? Or perhaps it wasn't about power at all, but survival. Had the Zeitler been forced into a position of vulnerability, just as humans had so often been in their history? A victim of circumstance, trapped in a never-ending cycle of conflict. The surgery neared its conclusion, and with it, Harper felt an overwhelming wave of exhaustion. She had done everything she could. There was nothing more she could give, nothing more she could do. Just as the last light in the room seemed to fade, and she prepared to declare the operation complete, something unexpected happened. The Zeitler began to stir. The Zeitler's movements were slow, deliberate, as though each limb carried the immense weight of its own existence. Harper leaned in, her eyes focused on the alien's chest, rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. The machines beat steadily, a subtle but undeniable sign that its condition was improving. The room, once dominated by tension and cold precision, now seemed to shift with a new energy, a kind of quiet disbelief. The Zeitler, against all odds, was alive. Is he? Dr. Lyle began, his voice trailing off as he leaned closer to the operating table, his hands hovering uncertainly over the alien's chest. Harper nodded, her own disbelief matching his. Yes, but we need to keep monitoring him. His vitals are improving, but we can't afford to be careless. The alien's eyes fluttered open, glowing faintly in the dim light of the room. Harper instinctively stepped back, but quickly steadied herself. It was clear now that he wasn't in a position to cause harm. His gaze wasn't one of aggression. There was confusion, pain, and something she hadn't expected: vulnerability. In that moment, the Zeitler was no longer the cold, ruthless conqueror she had imagined. He was a creature in pain, a being in need of help. The silence in the room grew heavy as the alien attempted to move, its limbs trembling slightly. Harper placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, urging him to stay still. "You need to rest," she said, her voice soft yet firm. "You're safe, for now." The Zeitler-esque gaze flickered toward her, his eyes widening in something almost like shock. Something unspoken passed between them, an exchange that transcended language. He seemed to tremble, not from weakness, but from a deep, primal fear. It was as if he couldn't comprehend why she, a human, was helping him. Or perhaps he was simply unsure why anyone would care for him at all. Harper quickly turned her attention back to the monitor. "His internal bleeding has stopped," she said, her mind still reeling from the alien's reaction. "The wound is healing well. We should move him to the recovery room soon." But as she began to issue the orders, a new thought began to form in her mind, one that grew more complex by the second. The Zeitler had been an enemy of humanity, a vicious predator. They were known for their merciless conquests and ruthless nature. Yet, here he was, dependent on her for his survival. Could it be that the Zeitler were not the cold-hearted creatures the galaxy had painted them to be? What if they were more than their reputation for violence? If they weren't the ruthless species humanity had been led to believe, then what did that mean for humanity's future? Could the truth about the Zeitler, about their real nature, shape everything? The quiet recovery room hummed with the steady pulse of machinery, its beeping the constant reminder of the fragile line between life and death. The Zeitler lay still on the bed, his massive form appearing almost peaceful in the sterile environment. Harper had spent countless hours by his side, observing him, waiting. Despite the fears that still gripped her heart and the nervous murmurs of the hospital staff, she couldn't deny the strange pull she felt toward this alien. It wasn't just his physical condition that fascinated her, it was the unspoken complexity of his existence. What had driven her to care so much? She couldn't pinpoint it. Perhaps it was the look in his eyes when he first regained consciousness, a mix of fear, confusion, and something almost like gratitude. It was the same look that Harper had seen in the eyes of countless humans, especially when faced with an unknown enemy. It was raw, vulnerable, and familiar. For the first time in a long while, Harper felt the weight of something far deeper than her professional duty. This was no longer about simply healing a patient. It was about understanding something fundamental about humanity, about the nature of life itself, and how that understanding might stretch into the stars. Harper stood at the foot of the Zeitler-esque bed, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of a medical chart. The alien's breathing had steadied, and the worst of his injuries seemed to be healing. But his condition was still precarious. She had never encountered a creature like him. The stories of the Zeitler, the brutal, merciless conquerors who showed no mercy, seemed utterly at odds with the being lying in front of her. The hospital's director had made it clear that he wanted the alien transferred to a containment facility immediately. He insisted that the Zeitler was a threat, and it was only a matter of time before the higher-ups would make a decision to classify him as a danger to humanity. But Harper refused to follow the orders. She understood the risks. She knew what harboring a potential enemy soldier meant. But the pain in the Zeitler-esque eyes, the fear, the vulnerability it spoke to her in ways she couldn't ignore. The silence of the room was broken by the soft swish of the door opening. Dr. Lyle entered, his expression weary and drawn, the pressure of the situation weighing heavily on him. "Harper," he said, his voice tight with concern. "You know what's happening outside this room, don't you?" Harper turned to face him, her gaze unwavering. "Yes, I know. They want him gone. But I can't let that happen." Dr. Lyle sighed, his expression softening as he regarded her. "I understand, Harper, but you're playing with fire. If the government finds out you've been hiding him, they won't show mercy. And if he wakes up, if he's anything like the rumors say, this won't just be a hospital problem. It'll be a planetary problem. Harper didn't respond right away. His words hung heavy in the air. But as she looked back at the Zetla still form, a deep, stubborn resolve filled her chest. She couldn't just turn her back on him, not now, not after everything. She couldn't let fear dictate her actions. "You really believe he's a monster?" she asked quietly, her voice soft but firm. "Not after everything we've seen. He's not like the others." Dr. Lyle shook his head, eyes narrowing with a mixture of concern and disbelief. "You're right, we don't know what he is. But I've seen enough to know the Zetla don't spare anyone they deem weak." "Harper, you're risking everything." Harper didn't flinch. She stepped closer to the alien's bedside, her hand hovering just above his, though she didn't touch him. Her voice softened to a whisper. "I can't abandon him. Not now. We need to understand him maybe. Through him, we can understand ourselves." For a long moment, Dr. Lyle said nothing. The tension between them was palpable, thick with unspoken fears and unacknowledged truths. Finally, he sighed, a heavy, resigned sound, and spoke again. "Just be careful. Whatever happens, you're on your own." With that, Dr. Lyle turned and left, leaving Harper alone once again with the Zetla. She stood there, her heart heavy, her mind racing with questions. Despite everything she had been taught, despite the Zetla's terrifying appearance and brutal past, she couldn't bring herself to see him as the enemy anymore. Not now, not after what she had witnessed. There was something more to him, something human, or perhaps something beyond the labels and hatred they had assigned him. The days passed in a haze of tense silence, every moment fraught with the weight of unspoken words. The hospital itself seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for something to break. Word of the aliens' miraculous survival had spread like wildfire, and the air was thick with unease. Some of the staff continued with their duties, their faces drawn with suspicion. Casting furtive glances toward the recovery room, they whispered behind closed doors, some afraid of the consequences of harboring an alien, while others saw the opportunity to study a being from beyond the stars, chance to learn things they never thought possible. But outside the sterile walls of the hospital, the story had exploded. The media had picked up on the news, and soon the airwaves were filled with inflammatory reports and escalating fears. The government had issued a statement, warning the public that the Zetla might be part of a larger invasion force. They urged citizens to remain vigilant, emphasizing the danger of any Zetla encountered. They painted the alien as an irredeemable foe, a harbinger of destruction. To Harper, it was nothing more than government propaganda, carefully constructed to demonize what they couldn't understand. It made her stomach churn, and a deep sense of sadness settled within her. The Zetla, under her care, however, was nothing like the monster the world believed him to be. He hadn't moved much, still recovering from the wounds that had almost taken his life, but Harper could see the small changes. The way his eyes tracked her movements, how they followed her with an intelligence that seemed to grow clearer every day. His gaze wasn't hostile. It was more like a curious child's, watching and learning. Despite the lingering language barrier, Harper could sense that he was adapting, trying to understand this strange new world around him. One evening, as Harper sat beside his bed, absorbed in her thoughts, a sudden crash sounded from down the hall. The sound ripped through the tension, jolting her upright. Her heart raced, and she instinctively turned to the Zetla, who had already tensed, his eyes wide with alarm. His muscles coiled, ready to spring into action. Harper held up a hand, her voice shaky as she tried to calm him, though her own uncertainty mirrored his. Before she could speak, the door slammed open and Dr. Lyle rushed in, his face pale, eyes wide with panic. "They're here," he gasped, his voice strained. "The government sent a strike team. They've come for him." Harper's blood turned to ice. The sounds of boots pounding down the hallway grew louder, each step a drumbeat of impending doom. There was no time to waste. "You need to get him out of here," Dr. Lyle urged, his voice tight with urgency. "If they find him, they'll kill him. They'll think he's a threat." Harper's gaze locked onto the Zettler. His eyes met hers, and for the first time since he had arrived, she saw something different, a quiet understanding. In that fleeting moment, she realized that he wasn't just an enemy, a mindless force of destruction. He was a living being, one with instincts, with thoughts. And right now, those instincts screamed for survival. "I won't let them hurt you," Harper whispered, the words barely escaping her lips, though she had no idea how she would stop the inevitable. The door to the recovery room burst open, and armed soldiers flooded in, their boots striking the floor like thunder. Harper moved instinctively, stepping in front of the Zeitler, her body a barrier between the soldiers and the alien lying in front of her. She could feel her knees shaking, her heart pounding in her chest, but she didn't back down. "You can't take him," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The words firm and unyielding despite the fear that threatened to break through. The lead soldier sneered, his rifle raised and aimed directly at her. "Step aside, nurse. This creature is dangerous. You're jeopardizing all of us." Harper's pulse raced, and every nerve in her body screamed at her to run, to step aside and avoid the confrontation. But she stood her ground. She couldn't let them take him. She couldn't let them kill him, not without a fight. She swallowed the lump in her throat, her eyes never leaving the soldiers, the tension in the room palpable, ready to snap. The soldiers' weapons glinted under the harsh fluorescent lights, but Harper's gaze remained locked on the lead soldier's face. She wouldn't back down, not now. Her mind raced. She had no weapon, no plan, only the instinct to protect. For a moment, the room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the distant sound of more soldiers approaching. Time seemed to stretch out, each second a fragile thread hanging by a whisper. Harper could feel her breath coming in shallow bursts, her heart pounding in her ears, but she didn't waver. "I'm not leaving," she said, the words coming out louder this time, more confident. She didn't know how it would end, but in that moment, one thing was clear. She wasn't going to let the Zeitler die, not without trying to protect him, no matter the cost. The air in the recovery room was suffocating, thick with tension, as if the walls themselves could sense the impending conflict. The soldiers, cloaked in their armored suits, formed an intimidating line, their weapons drawn and aimed directly at Harper and the Zet. Their presence was like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest, the mechanical hiss of their breathing amplifying the eerie silence that filled the room. Every second stretched out, sharp and agonizing. Harper's pulse hammered in her ears as she took a single step forward, her body instinctively positioning itself between the soldiers and the wounded alien. She wasn't a fighter, she wasn't a soldier, nor was she trained for this kind of confrontation. But she was here, and this was her decision. This was her fight. And for the first time in her life, she realized that standing her ground wasn't just about her own survival. It was about protecting something that couldn't defend itself. "You don't understand." Harper's voice broke the silence, shaky but resolute. "He's not a monster. He's not your enemy." The lead soldier, towering and cold-eyed, sneered at her words, his grip tightening on the rifle. His gaze never wavered from the Zeitler, whose chest rose and fell shallowly on the bed. "You're blind, nurse," he spat, his voice dripping with disdain. "This creature, this thing, has slaughtered thousands. Entire civilizations have been wiped out by the Zeitler. You think some human gestures are going to change what it is?" Harper's chest tightened, but she shook her head, her mind racing. She knew the Zettler's reputation. They were ruthless conquerors, their invasions leaving nothing but death in their wake. She had heard the stories, the devastation, the destruction, the terror they brought wherever they went. But this alien in front of her was not a general. He wasn't a soldier or a warrior. He was injured, vulnerable, and, if nothing else, he was human in the way he struggled to understand the violence of his past. "I know what they've done," Harper said quietly, her voice unwavering, "but he's hurt. He's not an enemy. He needs medical attention, not execution." The soldier's eyes narrowed, and his finger hovered ominously over the trigger. "You're wrong. He's a threat. The Zeitler are a plague on the galaxy, and now they're here on Earth. We won't make the same mistake twice." Before Harper could respond, a sharp sound rang out from the hallway, distant thump, followed by the unmistakable chatter of radios and the rapid footfalls of reinforcements. More soldiers were coming. The walls seemed to close in around them. Time was running out. Then, as if to punctuate the growing tension, the Zeitler stirred. His alien eyes snapped open, locking onto the soldiers with a fierce clarity. The subtle signs of panic flickered in his irises, his breathing quickening. His body trembled, and yet there was something more. Harper took an instinctive step backward, but she didn't turn away. The Zeitler's muscles tightened, and his limbs, still weak from the injuries he had sustained, moved with a purpose. A hum filled the air, like an electrical pulse, emanating from the alien as if his body were charging in response to the threat. Harper's heart raced as she realized something she hadn't understood until this moment. The Zeitler wasn't reacting out of blind fear or rage. No, he was calculating. His eyes, once filled with confusion, now showed something else, something sharper, understanding. He knew the soldiers were a threat, but he wasn't about to lash out. No, he was preparing, assessing, weighing his options as though he were a strategist, not a beast. As Harper's eyes flicked from the soldiers to the alien, she saw the truth. This creature was not what the world had been led to believe. He wasn't mindless. He wasn't driven by bloodlust. He was intelligent. He was aware. And right now, he was making a choice just as she was. They were no different. Both fighting for survival. Both trapped in a battle they didn't choose. The soldiers, still wary but beginning to show cracks in their composure, stood firm. The lead soldier barked an order, his voice unsteady, betraying his own fear. "Move in, take him down." But the moment the order was given, the Zeitler moved. His body exploded into motion, faster than Harper could process. In an instant, he was on the move, darting between the soldiers with an elegance that was both graceful and deadly. His movements were precise, his focus unwavering. But unlike the bloodthirsty killing machines the soldiers had expected, the Zeitler didn't attack, he defended. He didn't strike to kill. Instead, he disabled, disarmed, and avoided. Each move was calculated for survival, not conquest. Harper's heart leaped as she watched the alien knock one soldier aside. The force of the impact sending the man crashing into a wall. Another soldier fired, but the Zeitler was already moving, his speed a blur, his reflexes honed by years of training. He dodged, spun, and barely avoided the blast. "Get down," Harper screamed, instinctively dropping to the floor, the soldiers' weapons sparking as they fired into the air. The Zeitler dodged every shot, his agility and awareness leaving the soldiers scrambling, unable to land a hit. His movements were almost inhuman, each one executed with a level of precision that only someone who had spent their life in combat could achieve. But Harper noticed something else in him, something unexpected, a deep sense of restraint. He wasn't trying to annihilate the soldiers. He wasn't driven by the rage that his reputation had suggested. Instead, he was protecting her. The chaos continued, but as the soldiers regrouped, trying to rally, the Zeitler turned toward Harper. Their eyes locked for just a moment, a silent exchange. She saw it in his gaze. Trust, a willingness to follow her lead, to do whatever it took to escape. He wasn't just fighting for his life, he was fighting for hers. For a fleeting second, the Zeitler paused, his tail swinging out to unbalance another soldier. The alien moved with the grace of someone who had fought countless battles and knew the stakes. But when the last soldier was knocked to the ground, the Zeitler didn't press the attack. Instead, he turned, his eyes searching for Harper's. "Run," Harper whispered, her voice barely a breath. She didn't know if it was the right choice, but in that moment, it was the only choice. The Zeitler hesitated, looking back at her one last time before he sprinted toward the door. As he reached the threshold, he stopped, glancing back once more. Harper's breath caught in her throat. She saw the decision in his eyes, and before she could react, he disappeared into the hallway, running for his life. The soldiers followed, their weapons raised, but Harper was left standing there, shaken. The truth was undeniable now. They weren't just fighting the Zeitler, they were fighting their own fear, their own ignorance. And if humanity was ever going to survive, it would need to confront what lay beyond the narrow scope of its understanding. The corridors of the hospital were chaos incarnate. Civilian screams echoed in the distance, mingling with the frantic bark of military orders, while the sharp staccato clatter of boots reverberated off the sterile walls. Harper's heart raced as she stumbled through the hallways, her body strained with exhaustion but her resolve unwavering. She needed to reach the emergency exit, needed to escape before they found her. The Zeitler had disappeared into the shadows, vanishing like smoke, but the soldiers were relentless. She had no clue where he had gone, but she felt the pulse of their pursuit, an overwhelming reminder that her decision had spiraled far beyond her control. The hospital's security system had locked down, trapping them inside. Yet the soldiers tore through the building, their efforts undeterred. Harper could hear their voices over the comms, urgent and cold. "Secure all exits. Find the alien. He must be neutralized at all costs." A chill ran down her spine. She could hear the gunfire, the shouting, the heavy footsteps closing in on her. The pursuit had begun, and it was clear now there was no turning back. The weight of her decision, heavy and suffocating, settled on her shoulders. The Zeitler wasn't just a casualty of a galactic war anymore. To the government, he was the threat. But to Harper, he had become something else entirely. She had witnessed the humanity in his eyes, the vulnerability, the desperation to survive, not to destroy. And even if the world couldn't see it, she would not let him die without a fight, no matter the cost. Harper rounded a corner, heart hammering in her chest, and spotted a small maintenance closet. It was her only option, the only way to hide, even for a moment. She ducked inside, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she pressed her back against the cold, metal door. The claustrophobic space offered her little comfort, but it was enough for now. She needed a plan, needed to find the alien and get him out of here before it was too late. The comms device in her hand buzzed, the familiar voice of Lyle crackling through the speaker. But there was no warmth in his tone. It was distant, businesslike. "Harper, it's Lyle. We've lost contact with you. What's going on?" Her hand tightened around the device, her frustration mounting. "They're coming for him, Lyle. I need help." A long pause followed. Harper could hear Lyle's breath, the hesitation in his voice before he responded. "You've got to be kidding me. Harper, you're putting everyone at risk." "I don't care about that right now," she snapped, her voice raw, betraying the strain of her emotions. "This isn't just about the alien anymore. This is about something bigger than all of us. It's about what we're willing to do to protect life, no matter where it comes from. I'm going to help him. You can either help me or stay out of my way." She could feel the weight of Lyle's silence over the comms, the conflict raging on the other end. But after what felt like an eternity, his voice came through, heavy with resignation. "All right, you have my support, but from here on, you're on your own." Harper didn't wait another second. She ended the call, shoving the device into her pocket as she sprinted for the nearest ventilation hatch. Time was against her. She didn't know how long she had before the soldiers found the hidden passageways, but she couldn't afford to waste a second. Her hands trembled as she worked to pry the hatch open, her mind buzzing with the knowledge that the clock was ticking and that every minute could be their last. With a final push, the hatch gave way, and she crawled into the narrow duct system. The smell of stale air and metal filled her nose, making her stomach twist in discomfort. But there was no time to stop. She had to keep moving, had to keep searching for the Zeitler, before the soldiers reached him or her. The feeling of impending doom gnawed at her, urging her forward. She had no idea where he had gone, but the old ventilation shafts were the only way out. If the Zeitler was trying to escape, he would have to use them. It was her only hope. But then, as she moved deeper into the vents, a realization struck her with the force of a blow. The soldiers weren't just hunting the Zeitler, they were hunting her too. The whispers she'd overheard in the hallways, the mentions of traitors and covert operations suddenly made sense. Harper wasn't just helping a wounded alien. She had become part of something larger, something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. And now, with the soldiers closing in, she was a target. If she didn't act fast, she might never get out of this alive. The betrayal stung more deeply than she had anticipated. She thought she was doing the right thing. She thought she was fighting for something greater, an act of compassion in a universe that had none. But now, she was nothing more than a pawn in a game much bigger than she had ever known, and there was no going back. As she crawled through the ducts, her mind raced. What had she gotten herself into? The government's cold, calculating pursuit was not just about silencing an alien. It was about silencing anyone who dared to stand against them. She was an enemy now, just like the Zeitler, and if they had their way, there would be no place for her in this world. But Harper wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. Not when there was still a chance to save him. She had to keep going. Had to find the Zeitler before they found her. The sound of her own breath was deafening in the cramped air vents. Harper's heart hammered against her ribs, each thud a frantic reminder of how far she had already pushed herself and how much farther she had to go. The walls of the narrow passageways seemed to close in with every twist and turn, stretching the seconds into what felt like an eternity. She hadn't found the Zeitler yet, and the soldiers were getting closer. Time was running out, and she couldn't afford to slow down, not for a moment. Every footfall echoed in the metallic corridors, every creak of the vent system vibrating through the metal grates beneath her. She could hear her own pulse in her ears, the sharp staccato rhythm of fear and adrenaline. The Zeitler had been on the run for hours now, but there was still no sign of him. She had to find him before the soldiers did. Everything would be lost. At one point, the vent system split into two separate paths. Harper stopped, crouching low, her senses straining. She could hear its footsteps, distant but unmistakable, coming from one of the tunnels. Her muscles froze, instinctively tensing. Her fingers gripped the metal grate tightly as she held her breath, trying to remain as silent as possible. The soldiers were getting closer, their footsteps steady, methodical. They were following the same path she had just taken. Her eyes darted between the two passages, the sound of the soldiers' boots growing louder, the pressure building with each passing second. She had to act fast. Every decision now was life or death, not just for her, but for the alien who had trusted her enough to let her help him. In the distance, she thought she heard something, a faint, scraping sound, almost like claws dragging against metal. A chill ran through her as her mind raced. Could it be him? Was it the Zettler? Had he been using the tunnels all along to escape, hiding in plain sight? Harper didn't waste another second. She made her choice and took the left path. She moved as quietly as she could, her body low, each movement deliberate and controlled. Every instinct screamed at her to rush, to move faster, but she knew that speed would get her caught. The only way to succeed was to remain calm, to stay quiet, and to trust that her decisions would lead her to him. The further Harper crawled, the more something seemed off. The air, once stale and recycled, began to feel different. A faint, almost imperceptible hum vibrated through the walls, a strange energy in the air that she couldn't explain. It was as though something alive was moving through the very structure of the hospital. Something she couldn't see but could feel, an undercurrent, a pulse of life that whispered just beyond the edges of her understanding. The sensation was unsettling. She pushed the unease to the back of her mind, focusing on the task at hand, finding the Suddenly, the vent system opened into a small, hidden chamber. The air was thick with tension, the dim glow of emergency lights casting eerie shadows on the walls. And in the center of the room, standing still and almost statuesque, was the Zettler. His eyes met hers, and in that moment, the world seemed to fall away. The chaos, the soldiers, the danger, they all faded into the background. The only thing that mattered was the quiet exchange between them. There was an eerie calm to the way the Zettler stood. It wasn't fear, it wasn't aggression, it wasn't even suspicion. It was understanding. He didn't see her as an ally, not exactly, but there was a shared recognition between them, something unspoken and yet undeniably present. "You found me," the Zettler said, his voice rough, but not in the way Harper had expected. The words came through in a guttural alien tongue, the sound raw and alien, but somehow familiar. The first words they had ever shared, and the gravity of that moment hit her like a wave. Harper's heart swelled with something she couldn't name. She stepped forward cautiously, but with determination. "I won't let them hurt you, not anymore." For the briefest of moments, the Zettler's eyes softened. There was something there, something that made her think he understood her words, even if he couldn't fully comprehend their meaning. He stepped forward slowly, his movements cautious, unsure of how she might respond. His every gesture was laden with both urgency and a strange hesitation. But he didn't pull away. He didn't run. Before Harper could speak again, a distant sound interrupted the fragile moment, the unmistakable sound of boots. Soldiers approaching fast, her breath caught in her throat. Panic surged through her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. "We need to go, now." The Zettler-esque tail flicked behind him with barely contained urgency. He understood the danger. He needed to escape. But as he turned to lead the way, Harper's comms device buzzed in her pocket. Lyle's voice crackled through, low and urgent. "Harper, you need to know. They've already issued the orders. They're coming for you both." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. The betrayal she had felt before now took on a new, more terrifying form. She wasn't just trying to protect the Zeitler anymore. Now, the government had made it clear they would stop at nothing to eliminate both of them. Harper wasn't just a bystander in this war anymore. She was a target. The weight of that realization settled over her like a heavy cloak, but she had no time to dwell on it. There was no turning back now. She had chosen her side, and she would face whatever came next, no matter the cost. With a final glance at the Zettler, Harper followed him into the unknown. The danger was closing in, but there was no other choice. She had to trust in the choices they had both made and hope that, together, they could survive whatever came next. Harper's blood ran cold as the words from Lyle's comms echoed in her mind, crashing through her thoughts like thunder. "They're coming for you both." The weight of the revelation slammed into her chest, each syllable a reminder that everything she had risked, everything she had believed in, was now part of a far deadlier game. The Zettler wasn't just a victim anymore. He was a target, just like her. They were both pawns, and they had no choice but to fight their way out. The heavy footfalls of the soldiers grew louder outside the hidden chamber. The pressure was mounting with every second, and Harper could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins. There was no time to hesitate. The alien's calm, almost unreadable expression held her gaze as she made her decision. "We need to move." "Now," she said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. The Zeitler didn't hesitate. He didn't need to be told twice. His eyes met hers, and with a slight nod, he moved toward the exit. The tension in the air was palpable, every fiber of Harper's being urging her to act before it was too late. But as the Zeitler took a step forward, Harper's hand shot out, gripping his arm, stopping him in his tracks. "Wait," she breathed, her voice low but firm. The alien's gaze flickered down at her, his brow furrowing ever so slightly, as if unsure of what she meant. She could feel the weight of their situation pressing down on her, the finality of their choices hanging in the balance. Harper took a deep breath, willing herself to stay calm, to think clearly. She couldn't just run. She couldn't let fear dictate their fate. "We're not running, we're fighting." The Zeitler's eyes narrowed, his alien mind processing the words in his own way. There was no misunderstanding this time. The fight wasn't just about survival, it was about something deeper. She wasn't just protecting him anymore. She wasn't just trying to help him escape. He was no longer a helpless stranger. He had become her ally. And now, they both had a choice to make. Run and hide, or stand and fight. The Zeitler's head tilted slightly, as if considering her words. Harper felt a spark of something, a connection that transcended language, culture, or species. He wasn't just a refugee anymore. He wasn't the victim. He was a warrior, a survivor, and he understood her need to fight. They weren't so different after all. With a deep, almost imperceptible nod, the Zeitler pulled away from her grasp, moving silently toward the exit. Harper followed, her pulse steadying as they stepped into the darkness. Every footstep, every sound in the hallway seemed amplified now. The soldiers were closing in, their voices sharp and commanding, the threat of discovery pressing in from all sides. The dim light of the hidden chamber flickered behind them, casting long, haunting shadows as they moved deeper into the complex. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if the walls themselves were closing in on them. But Harper didn't let that stop her. They had no other choice but to move forward. The soldiers weren't far behind. She could hear them now, the sound of boots striking the metal floors, the rapid chatter of comms as they moved closer. The hallway ahead seemed endless, a labyrinth of shadows and uncertainty. But in that moment, with the Zeitler by her side, Harper felt a flicker of something stronger than sheer determination. They had no time left. It was now or never. As the first soldier's shadow appeared around the corner, Harper motioned to the Zeitler. With a swift, coordinated movement, they ducked into an adjoining hallway, just out of sight. The soldiers passed by, unaware of the danger that had slipped right beneath their noses. Harper held her breath, her body pressed against the cold wall, her heart racing. The seconds felt like hours. She couldn't afford to make a sound. Every fiber of her being screamed for them to run, to get out before they were caught. But they had to be careful. They couldn't risk making the wrong move. Not now, not when they were so close. As the soldiers disappeared down the corridor, Harper exhaled, releasing the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. They had made it this far, but this was just the beginning. They still had to make it to the exit. The Zeitler glanced back at her, his eyes gleaming with something fierce and unspoken. They were in this together now. Whatever happened next, they would face it as a team. Harper nodded in silent agreement. They would fight, or they would die trying. There was no turning back anymore. And so, with the soldiers just moments behind them, they made their move. Each step was a gamble, but it was a gamble they had no choice but to take. The final escape had begun. The tension between Harper and the Zeitler was palpable. As they moved through the hospital's darkened hallways, they had only one goal now: escape. But as they neared the exit, the final line of defense was clear. There would be no leaving without confrontation. The soldiers had surrounded the building, blocking all exits. The world outside was descending into chaos as the alien race, the so-called invaders, loomed over the planet. The fate of humanity now rested on their shoulders, Harper and the Zeitler. But as they neared the main doors, a realization hit Harper. This was more than an escape. It was a statement of defiance against the forces that sought to destroy them both, and a symbol of the humanity that still burned within her, even as she fought alongside an alien. She turned to the Zeitler, who stood tall, his posture shifting as he prepared for what was to come. The soldiers would never understand, but they had no choice. He wasn't the monster they had been taught to fear. He was a living, breathing being, struggling to survive, just like her. But as they pushed through the final line of defense, reality began to warp. The hospital walls, once cold and unforgiving, began to pulse as if they were alive, responding to the growing tension between the two. The air, once dry and unchanging, thickened, compressed by some unseen force, a presence larger than either of them could comprehend. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, no longer solid, but fluid, defying physics. Every step they took pulled them further from normalcy. They were moving, but not in a human way. The corridors seemed to change, stretching and twisting, as if the hospital were a fragile layer of fabric being torn apart by something far greater. When the soldiers arrived, they were no longer mere authoritative figures or armed threats. They were distorted. Their silhouettes were made of pulsating shadows, blending into the very air. Their weapons were no longer simple instruments of death. They were extensions of their collective will, something far more abstract. Harper felt a laugh inside her, a sense of detachment from reality. She knew it didn't make sense, but that was precisely what made the battle even more desperate. She was no longer just fighting for survival. She was fighting against the very fabric of reality, which seemed to tear itself apart with each passing second. The Zeitler now, was no longer just an alien creature. He was something more. He was no longer just someone she needed to protect. He was a manifestation of the universe itself in collapse. His skin shifted, patterns moving, as if he was a physical representation of chaos, destruction, and rebirth. Harper realized she was no longer just defending her life. She was defending the very concept of resistance in a world where order no longer existed. She was being pulled into something larger, a universe at war with itself. The battle was no longer between her and the soldiers. It was between what had been and what was to come. And then, as if the universe was listening to her thoughts, reality tore once again. Harper and the Zeitler broke through the line of defense. But it wasn't a physical line. It was a line between worlds. They weren't just escaping. They were escaping the very structure of what they knew. And in doing so, they were reshaping the rules of the game. By doing so, Harper and the Zeitler weren't just surviving. They were rewriting destiny. They were crossing the line of defense in a way that would never be understood. They were more than beings from a broken world. They were the new architects of reality, forcing the universe to mold itself around them. The future was no longer in the hands of those who hunted them. It was in theirs.